There are fast cars, and then there are cars you're not even allowed to own. And honestly, that's where this story begins. Because the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 wasn't dangerous in the way people expected. It wasn't unpredictable. It wasn't trying to kill you. If anything, it was too precise, too controlled. And that's what makes this whole thing feel strange. Because when people talk about it today, they don't just talk about speed. They talk about restriction, about how something so desired became so difficult to have. And when you hear that for the first time, it doesn't really make sense. Why this car, out of everything on the road? Why this one? To understand that, you have to go back. Not to the R34 itself, but to the idea behind it. Because long before it became a global icon, the Skyline name meant something very different. It wasn't about exclusivity. It wasn't about being untouchable. It was about engineering, precision, consistency. A quiet kind of performance that didn't need attention, but always earned it. And that's where Nissan comes in. At the time, they weren't trying to build a legend. They were trying to build something that worked better than anything else around it. And they kept refining that idea. Generation after generation, each version getting closer to something sharper, more complete, until eventually, the Skyline started to separate itself. Not because it was loud, but because it was different. Then came the GT-R, and everything changed. Because the GT-R wasn't just another version of the Skyline. It was a statement, a shift in direction, a decision to push performance, further than it had ever gone before. And once that door opened, there was no going back. The thing about the GT-R is that it didn't start as a global icon. It started as a problem, not for drivers, but for everyone trying to compete with it. Because once Nissan decided to take performance seriously, they didn't do it halfway. They went all in. And you could see it in the way the cars behaved, not just fast in a straight line, but composed, balanced, almost calculated, like every movement had already been thought through. And that's where things began to shift. Because in a world where most performance cars relied on brute force, the GT-R relied on control, precision, consistency. It didn't just want to be faster, it wanted to be better. And then came the turning point, motorsport. Because that's where theories get tested, and reputations get built. The earlier GT-R models didn't just show up to race, they dominated, over and over again. And when that started happening, people began to notice, not just fans, but competitors. Because suddenly, this car from Japan was outperforming machines that were supposed to be superior. Cars with bigger names, bigger histories, bigger expectations, and yet, they couldn't keep up. That's when the Skyline stopped being just a car and started becoming a threat, a real one. Because when something wins consistently, it forces everyone else to react, to adjust, to catch up, and not everyone could. By the time the later generations started arriving, the foundation was already set. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. That part was done. Now it was about refinement, taking everything that worked and pushing it further, smoother, faster, smarter. And this is where things get interesting, because on the surface, it still looked like evolution, just another step forward. But underneath, something bigger was happening. Technology was starting to take over, not in an obvious way, but in a way you could feel. The car wasn't just responding anymore. It was anticipating, adjusting, helping. And for its time, that was unusual, because most performance cars still relied heavily on the driver. Skill made the difference. Experience made the difference. But the Skyline was starting to change that equation. Just a little. Not enough to take control away, but enough to give you an edge. And once that idea takes hold, it changes everything. Because now, performance isn't just about power. It's about how that power is used. And that's what made the next step inevitable. Because if you keep refining something long enough, eventually you reach a point where it becomes something else entirely. Not just better, not just faster, but different. And that's exactly what happened next. Because when the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 finally arrived, it didn't feel like an upgrade. It felt like a statement. And then it arrived. the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34. At first glance, it didn't look revolutionary. Not in the way some cars do. It wasn't trying to shock you. It wasn't screaming for attention. If anything, it looked restrained, controlled, like it knew exactly what it was and didn't need to prove it. But that's the thing about cars like this. The real story isn't in how they look, it's in how they feel. Because underneath that calm exterior was something very different, something precise, something deliberate. And honestly, this is where most people get it wrong, because when they talk about performance, they think about numbers, horsepower, speed, acceleration. But the R34 wasn't just about that. It was about how everything came together. The engine, a twin-turbocharged inline-six that didn't just produce power. It delivered it in a way that felt controlled, predictable, like it was always one step ahead of you. And then there was the system behind it, all-wheel drive, but not the kind that just reacts, the kind that adjusts, constantly, quietly, sending power where it needed to go, before you even realized it. And this is where things start to shift, because now you're not just driving, you're working with the car, and the car is working with you. It's subtle, but once you feel it, you don't forget it, because suddenly, corners feel different, acceleration feels different, confidence feels different. And that confidence, that's what made the R34 special, not because it was easy, but because it made difficult things feel manageable. And then there was something else, something that, at the time, felt almost out of place. A screen, right there in the dashboard, displaying real-time performance data, boost pressure, throttle input, all of it. Today that might not seem like a big deal, but back then, that was rare, unusual, almost unnecessary, depending on how you looked at it. But it told you something important. This wasn't just a driver's car, it was a thinking car, a machine that understood itself and showed you what it was doing. And when you combine all of that, the balance, the control, the feedback, you get something that doesn't just perform well, it feels complete. And that's the part people don't always talk about, because on paper, it doesn't seem extreme. It doesn't look like the most powerful car of its time. It doesn't sound like the most aggressive, but in reality, it was one of the most refined. And sometimes that's more dangerous, because when something feels that controlled, that composed, you start to trust it, maybe a little too much. And that's where the story begins to turn. Because while the R34 was building its reputation in one part of the world, something very different was happening in another. Not because of what it did on the road, but because of where it wasn't allowed to go. And this is where everything changes, because up to this point, the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 was just a great car, respected, admired, even loved, but still, just a car. Then came the restriction, and suddenly, it became something else. Because outside of Japan, especially in places like the United States, owning one wasn't simple. In fact, for most people, it wasn't possible at all. And when people first hear that, the assumption is obvious. It must have been too fast, too extreme, too dangerous for the road. But the reality is a lot less dramatic, and honestly, a lot more frustrating. Because it wasn't banned for being too powerful. It wasn't restricted because it was uncontrollable. It came down to something much simpler. Regulations, import laws, standards that the car simply didn't meet. Because it wasn't built for that market. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because in the United States, cars have to follow very specific rules, safety requirements, emission standards, testing procedures, all designed to ensure that every vehicle on the road meets a certain level of compliance. And if a car doesn't meet those standards, it doesn't matter how good it is. It doesn't matter how advanced it is. It doesn't get in. That's exactly what happened here. The R34 was built for Japan, designed around a completely different set of regulations, and bringing it into another country wasn't just difficult, it was restricted. There were ways around it, complex ones, expensive ones, but for the average person, it might as well have been impossible. And then there's the rule that changed everything, the 25-year rule, a regulation that allows older vehicles to be imported once they reach a certain age, not because they suddenly become safer, but because they're no longer considered modern vehicles under those standards. So, for years, people had to wait, literally, wait for time to pass, just to legally own a car that already existed. And think about that for a second. A machine that people wanted, but couldn't have. Not because it didn't work, not because it was flawed, but because it didn't fit within a system. And that's where the legend begins to grow, because restriction creates desire. The harder something is to get, the more people want it. And the R34 became the perfect example of that. It wasn't just rare, it was unreachable. And that changes how people see it, because now it's not just about performance anymore. It's about access, about exclusivity, about something being just out of reach. And then something else happened, something that pushed it even further. Culture, media, exposure. The car started appearing in places people couldn't ignore, on screens, in stories, in moments that made it feel larger than life. And for a generation of enthusiasts, this wasn't just a car anymore. It was the car, the one you couldn't have, the one you had to wait for, the one that felt just a little more special than everything else. And that's the irony of it all, because the restriction didn't limit the car, it amplified it. It turned something already great into something unforgettable. So now, years later, what are we actually looking at? Is the Nissan Skyline GT-R R34 legendary because of what it is, or because of what it wasn't allowed to be? Because when you strip everything back, the performance, the engineering, the technology, it's all still impressive, even today. But there are other cars like that, other machines that are fast, capable, refined, and yet they don't carry the same weight, they don't have the same presence. And that's where perception comes in, because sometimes what makes something special isn't just how good it is, it's how it was experienced, or in this case, how it wasn't. The waiting, the restriction, the distance between people, and the car itself. That's what shaped the story. And once that story takes hold, it doesn't go away. It evolves, it grows, it becomes something bigger than the product itself. And that's exactly what happened here, because the R34 didn't just stay relevant, it became timeless. Even people who have never driven one know what it is, know what it represents. And that's rare, because most cars, no matter how good, eventually fade. But this one didn't, because it was never just about driving it, it was about wanting it. And maybe that's the real reason it became so iconic. Not because it was too fast, not because it was too advanced, but because for a long time, it was just out of reach. And sometimes, that's all it takes. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, make sure you subscribe. There's a lot more to uncover.